Right now, somewhere inside your body, your red blood cells are quietly carrying a message that was written tens of thousands of years before the first human civilization ever lit a fire. That message is not in your name. It is not in your face or your height or the color of your eyes. It is locked inside a single protein sitting on the outer wall of every red blood cell flowing through your veins. And for most of your life, the medical world told you it was nothing special. Just a letter, just a plus sign on a hospital form. But a series of landmark studies stretching from the ancient DNA labs of Edinburgh to the cardiovascular research centers of Cleveland have now cracked open that letter, and what they found buried inside it is going to completely change the way you see yourself. Because if your blood type is OGA positive, your DNA is not just a biological fact. It is a survival archive, a record of ancient wars, impossible journeys, and a genetic contract your ancestors signed in blood to keep you alive today. Let us go back to where the confusion started. In 1901, an Austrian scientist named Karl Landsteiner was doing something that nobody had ever done with enough precision before. He was mixing blood samples together and watching what happened under a microscope. Sometimes the mixture stayed perfectly smooth and clear. Other times, the cells clumped together violently, forming thick, deadly clusters. He had just discovered the reason blood transfusions kept killing people. He named the 4 blood groups A, B, AB, and O, and it was one of the most important medical discoveries in human history. He received the Nobel Prize for it. But almost immediately after that discovery, a catastrophic assumption crept into Western science that would slow down the truth for nearly a century. European researchers looked at their own populations, saw that type A was extremely common across the continent, and made a decision that was more arrogance than analysis. They decided that type A must be the original, the ancestral default of all humanity. And type O, the version without certain antigens on the blood cell surface, was labeled a kind of stripped-down mutation, a later development, a lesser version. That assumption was not just wrong, it was completely and spectacularly backward. When genetic technology finally advanced to the point where scientists could stop looking at blood and start reading the actual DNA code underneath it, the entire picture flipped. The key turned out to be a single gene sitting on chromosome 9. This gene functions like a construction foreman deciding whether to build specific molecular structures called antigens on the outside surface of your red blood cells. Blood type A means one kind of antigen gets built. Type B means a different kind. Type AB means both. And type O means the foreman never gives the construction order at all. The cell surface stays smooth and clean, no antigen structures, just the basic foundation. When researchers began mapping this gene across populations all over the planet, the data they returned was nothing short of extraordinary. In Iceland and Scandinavia, type A dominated. In central parts of Asia, type B climbed to remarkable heights. But when scientists tested the indigenous peoples of North and South America, tribes whose ancestors had been genetically isolated from the rest of the human species for 30 to 40,000 years, they found something that made the scientific community stop and recalculate everything. In certain indigenous communities across the Americas, type O blood reached a frequency of nearly 100%. Not a majority, not a strong trend, every single person. In the entire science of genetics, when you see a trait expressed at that level of uniformity in an isolated population, there is only one explanation. Scientists call it a founder effect. It means the original group of people who first settled that land carried an overwhelming concentration of that trait, and they passed it down to every generation that followed, without interruption. And when you trace the migration routes of those original founders using modern ancient DNA analysis, every single path leads directly back to Asia. The ancestors of Native Americans walked out of the Asian continent. They crossed a now-vanished land corridor that once connected modern Siberia to modern Alaska during the last ice age. They were a small, extraordinary group of people, and they were carrying enormous quantities of type O blood. The rest of Asia today still holds one of the largest reservoirs of type O genetics on Earth. In the Philippines, roughly 45% of the population carries it. In Vietnam, the figure sits near 42%. And while the Asian continent is biologically diverse and carries every blood type, the sheer volume and geographic depth of the type O signature there is undeniable. When geneticists analyze the tiny molecular markers sitting around the type O gene in modern populations across every continent, the trail does not just point toward Asia. It leads directly into the deep prehistoric landscapes of the continent, into populations that existed long before any written record, any dynasty, or any empire ever rose or fell. But here's the question that the genetic trail alone cannot answer. Why did this specific blood type survive so successfully? Ice ages come and go, land bridges rise and sink, but a blood type does not dominate half the human species unless something in nature is giving it a very powerful reason to exist. The answer has almost nothing to do with cold weather or predators or geography. It has everything to do with the most relentless killers in all of human history. Not warriors, not wild animals, microbes. For hundreds of thousands of years, the diseases that wiped out the most human beings were not battles or famines in isolation. They were invisible. They were parasites, viruses, and bacteria traveling through water, air, insects, and skin contact. And your blood type, it turns out, is one of the primary battlefields where your body decides whether it lives or dies in those encounters. The first invisible war, where type O blood showed its power, is one of the oldest ongoing conflicts in human history, malaria. The malaria parasite, Plasmodium falciparum, is one of the most efficient killers nature ever produced. When it enters the human bloodstream, it invades red blood cells and uses a process called rosetting, where infected cells clump together with healthy ones, blocking blood flow to the brain and vital organs. This is what turns a malaria infection into a fatal emergency. But here's where type O blood does something remarkable. Because type O cells do not carry those antigen structures on their outer surface, the parasite cannot execute the rosetting process effectively. The infected cells simply refuse to bind together. The deadly traffic jam never forms. Research published by teams at Edinburgh University, later confirmed across multiple African and Asian populations, consistently shows that type O individuals have dramatically higher survival rates during severe falciparum malaria infections. And because malaria killed a staggering proportion of every ancient population that lived anywhere near tropical environments, the people who survived long enough to have children were disproportionately the ones carrying type O blood. Over thousands of generations, that survival advantage compounded into the massive global distribution we see today. Now, if that single advantage already sounds like a superpower, the second invisible war where type O blood provides protection is one that modern people still encounter every year: norovirus. The stomach bug that sweeps through schools, hospitals, offices, and cruise ships with almost unstoppable speed. Norovirus is extraordinarily contagious, and for most people, it means 2 to 3 days of complete misery. But what clinical research has revealed about how certain strains of norovirus actually infect cells is something that directly connects your blood type to your vulnerability. Several dominant strains of this virus need to physically attach to specific molecular structures, the very antigen structures found on type A and type B blood cells, in order to gain entry into the digestive tract lining. Type O blood cells, being smooth and free of those structures, simply give the virus nothing to grip. During tract outbreaks, researchers have documented type O individuals moving through heavily contaminated environments, fully exposed, without developing infection, while others around them fell ill. Across thousands of years of epidemic winters and seasonal outbreaks, that protection translated directly into survival and reproduction. Then came 2024, and a study that nobody saw coming. Researchers analyzing data from the UK Biobank, one of the largest and most comprehensive medical databases in the world, published findings in the journal Arteriosclerosis, Thrombosis, and Vascular Biology that confirmed something extraordinary. People with non-O blood types who had been hospitalized with COVID-19 faced roughly double the long-term risk of major cardiac events, including heart attack, stroke, and death, compared to type O individuals. The elevated risk persisted for more than 3 years after the initial infection. Type O blood appeared to carry a measurable protective effect, even against the cardiovascular damage caused by one of the most destructive respiratory viruses in modern memory. Dr. Houman Ali, the principal investigator on that study from the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California, described the mechanism as the virus being more likely to infect non-O blood cells and make them more open to viral entry. Type O carriers, by contrast, maintained their structural advantage even in a world that had no experience with that particular pathogen. The ancient architecture of the type O cell, shaped by 100,000 years of biological warfare, was still working exactly as it was designed to. But every story of survival has a shadow, and the shadow of type O blood is real, documented, and important to understand. Nature does not hand out advantages without balance. The same smooth, antigen-free surface that protects type O carriers against malaria and certain viruses leaves them significantly more vulnerable to other microscopic threats. Cholera is one of the most dramatic examples. The bacterium Vibrio cholerae releases a toxin that causes catastrophic fluid loss from the intestines, killing through dehydration at terrifying speed. Studies of severe cholera outbreaks, particularly in regions of South Asia, where the disease has been endemic for centuries, show clearly that the cholera toxin binds more aggressively and efficiently to type O blood cells than to any other type. During major epidemic events, type O, individuals suffer more severe dehydration, lose fluid faster, and have a significantly higher risk of dying from the infection. This biological reality is literally written into the geography of blood type distribution in India. In regions along the Ganges Delta where cholera has historically been devastating, the frequency of type O blood in local populations is measurably lower than in surrounding areas that were never as heavily affected. The environment selected against it over generations. The disease shaped the blood of the people who lived there. Then there is the bacteria that type O carriers and their physicians need to watch for across a lifetime. Helicobacter pylori is a spiral-shaped bacterium that lives in the stomach lining and is responsible for the majority of peptic ulcers in the world. What researchers have found consistently is that the biological environment of a type O stomach appears to be far more hospitable to this particular organism. The bacterium digs in more easily, inflames the stomach lining more aggressively, and causes damage that, if left untreated, can progress over years into serious gastric complications. This is not a minor statistical footnote. Type O individuals carry a meaningfully elevated lifetime risk of stomach ulcers compared to other blood types. And monitoring for H. pylori infection is something that clinical researchers studying East Asian populations, where both type O blood and H. pylori exposure rates are significant, consider especially important. There is also the question of bleeding. Type O blood naturally carries lower levels of certain clotting proteins, specifically von Willebrand factor and factor VIII. This is the reason type O carriers have a reduced risk of forming dangerous deep vein blood clots and a lower likelihood of suffering certain kinds of cardiovascular blockages compared to other blood types. On the positive side, this makes type O blood somewhat protective against thrombosis. But the other edge of that same biological blade is that when type O individuals are injured, they may bleed more freely and clot more slowly than other blood types. In surgical settings, this is something that careful medical teams pay attention to. Every single characteristic, every advantage, every vulnerability is a direct echo of an ancestral environment that your body is still responding to today. And then there is the mosquito problem, which sounds almost like a dark joke, but is backed by controlled clinical research. Scientists have conducted studies where volunteers placed their arms into boxes containing known quantities of mosquitoes and measured exactly how many bites each person received before the insects were removed. The findings were consistent and remarkable. Mosquitoes landed on and fed from type O individuals almost twice as frequently as they did from type A individuals. The insects appear to detect a chemical signal from type O carriers through the skin that marks them as a preferred food source. Given that mosquitoes are the primary vector for diseases like malaria and dengue fever, the very diseases that type O blood helps you survive once infected, there is an almost darkly elegant irony in the fact that you're also more likely to be bitten in the first place. But even within the broader story of type O blood, there is a chapter that most medical professionals and even most scientists did not know existed until a patient walked into a hospital in the city of Bombay in 1952 and changed everything. This patient tested as type O and needed a blood transfusion. When standard type O blood was administered, the patient's immune system launched a full rejection response. The medical team was baffled. Type O rejecting type O was supposed to be impossible. When researchers examined the blood more carefully, they discovered something that required entirely new language to describe. Think of the blood type system as a construction project. A and B antigens are like the upper floors of a building. Type O is the foundation, a base molecule called the H antigen, which every blood type is built on top of. But this patient had no foundation at all, not just no upper floors, no base structure whatsoever. This condition was named the Bombay phenotype. It looks identical to type O under basic testing because it carries no A or B antigens, but it is fundamentally different at the molecular level. And carriers can only ever safely receive blood from other Bombay phenotype donors. In most of the world, this genetic variation occurs in roughly one person per million. But in the Indian subcontinent, it appears in approximately 1 in 10,000 people, a striking regional concentration that suggests deep, ancient, localized genetic history that standard blood typing has never had the tools to read properly. Now zoom out to the full scale of human time and trace where type O blood actually traveled. Around 5,000 years ago, long after the land bridges connecting Asia to the Americas had disappeared beneath rising seas, a group of extraordinary seafarers from the island region, now known as Taiwan, did something that should have been impossible. They built open ocean canoes and began deliberately sailing into the largest body of water on Earth. These Polynesian explorers discovered Hawaii. They settled New Zealand. They landed on Easter Island, one of the most isolated specks of land in the entire Pacific Ocean. They mapped and colonized thousands of miles of ocean using only stars, wind patterns, and the swells of the sea as their navigation tools. What does all of this mean for you right now, reading this, knowing that O positive is what sits on your medical chart? It means that the letter O and the plus sign printed next to your name in a hospital file is not a bureaucratic detail. It is the surviving proof of an unbroken chain of human endurance stretching back further than any language, any religion, any kingdom, or any wall ever built by human hands. Somewhere in the extraordinarily distant past, your direct ancestors were navigating frozen steppes, crossing jungle river valleys thick with malaria, carrying mosquitoes, and surviving disease events that ended entire bloodlines around them. They did not have medicine. They did not have clean water or antibiotics or the ability to understand what was attacking them. All they had was their biology, and their biology held. Their cells stayed smooth and refused to let the parasite build its deadly bridge. Their stomachs survived the fever season, their bodies crossed the ocean, and then they did the most powerful thing that any living creature can do. They kept going. They had children, and those children had children. And somewhere along that chain, a person decided to keep moving, to cross the water, to climb the mountain, to follow the stars. And eventually, after tens of thousands of years of that same relentless forward motion, you appeared. The next time a doctor or a nurse writes O positive next to your name on a form, understand what you are actually looking at. You are looking at the oldest survival record in the history of your family. You are looking at the biological result of ancestors who stood in the middle of invisible wars and did not fall. Researchers in 2024 proved that this ancient architecture is still protecting you from modern threats that your great-grandparents never imagined. The same cellular structure that helped someone survive a malaria outbreak in ancient Southeast Asia was measurably shielding type O individuals from the cardiovascular consequences of a 21st century pandemic virus. Your body did not forget. It has been keeping a promise made in blood long before you were born, and it is keeping that promise still. Your veins are not just carrying oxygen and nutrients. They are carrying the longest unbroken story ever recorded, written not in ink or stone or digital code, but in the living architecture of every red blood cell circulating through your heart right now. Science is finally learning how to read those pages. And what they say is this: you are here because the people who came before you refused to disappear. Every vulnerability in your biology is the price they paid for a strength that kept them alive long enough to pass their story forward. And every strength in your biology is the medal they earned for surviving something that should have ended them. You are their victory. So drop down into the comments and tell me your blood type and where in the world your family traces back to. The connections people are finding in this community are extraordinary. Stay curious, stay grateful for the incredible survival machine you are living inside of, and I will see you in the next one.